So we're picking up today in chapter 16, the conquest of the West, with the struggling farmers. And in the last chapter, we mentioned the Homestead Act that was passed by a Republican Congress in 1862 and signed into law by Abe Lincoln. And the purpose of that was to give 160 acres of land to any family that would move west, including free slaves. But things did not really work out as planned, because even if that land was free, most landless Americans could not afford the cost of moving. And on top of it, they couldn't really purchase the necessary farm equipment to sustain themselves on that land. People who did maybe have some upfront money, like factory workers or anyone else who would be willing to move out west, really didn't have the skills to farm or the interest to become a farmer. And furthermore, the difficulties of farm life on the frontier were magnified just because of the uncertainties of the West. Native American groups, animals, different things out there, lack of medicine and things like that. To make matters worse, in 1876, Congress opened up a bunch of that land for sale that had been reserved for homesteaders immediately after the Civil War. So large speculators bought up a ton of that land, and private interests pretty much destroyed hopes of homesteaders settling the western frontier. So there were some corporate bonanza farmers who made profits, but even commercialized agriculture couldn't really withstand the droughts of the 1880s. Bonanza farmers are just farmers who went out west and made a quick profit due to good circumstances. But like I said, even they couldn't fight off the droughts in the 80s. Okay, so Western railroad building. Private companies who constructed railroads got reputations for corruption and being wasteful. And so the government subsidized the construction of Western railroads, and they did it through a combination of land grants and loans. And the government lands that were adjacent to the railroads were not open to homesteading, because free land would prevent the railroads from selling that land at a really good price or a really expensive price. The government and railroads were aware that the land near the railroads would become really profitable. That is where businesses would be, that is where people would be attracted to, factories would be built because of the shipping possibilities with the railroads. So land grant railroads encouraged the growth of the West by advertising and by selling their lands. And of course, they provided inexpensive transportation and shipping for settlers. Cattle Kingdom. So the cattle industry developed because there was an increased demand for meat in eastern cities. Also the expansion of the railroad network. So cattle were driven from Texas on westward on the railroads. And that is where cattlemen sold cattle for substantial profits. And the long drive produced the American cowboy. Interestingly, not most of them, but a third of them were either Mexican or black. But cattle towns like Abilene and Wichita and Dodge City thrived because of the cattle industry. And a lot of times they had the reputation for being disorderly or violent or full of crime, but life in these towns was not as disorderly as legend would have it. Open ranch ranching. And this is kind of like when we talked in European history, if you took that course, we talked about the enclosure movement in England. And prior to the enclosure movement in England, people worked the land communally. And so this is sort of what happened with open ranch ranching. Cattlemen began raising their stock closer to railroad depots just to eliminate the long drive. But In the northern plains, the good thing about ranching was that really, as long as you had cattle and access to water, you were fine. You were fine. And the open ranch made the actual ownership of land unnecessary. Ranchers would band together and get legal title to water courses and graze their cattle in common on adjacent lands, and sometimes their herds became intermixed and could only be distinguished by their brand, like branding, when you stick the metal rod in the fire and you brand your cattle. But Easterners and Europeans invested in the ranches because they were profitable, and a few large ranches eventually came to dominate the industry. Which brings us to barbed wire warfare. So by the mid-1880s, crowding on the range and lack of clear land titles ended up giving rise to conflict and violence. And to make matters worse, Congress refused to change the land laws and thereby encouraged those who could not get title to enough land legally to resort to fraud. And so individuals and groups began to fence off large areas of land that they considered their own. And this was made possible by the invention of barbed wire. Unfortunately, fencing in land that was not legally theirs often led to conflict. So overproduction over time drove down beef prices, and many sections were overgrazed. And then you had the severe winter of 1886 and 1887 that killed between 80 and 90% of cattle on the range. And so this effectively brought an end to open ranch cattle ranching. And the industry eventually revived, but it was on a much smaller, more efficient scale. And so with our final note on barbed wire warfare, we will bring chapter 16 to a close.